Should workers in essential services be refused the right to strike?
Should workers in essential services be refused the right to strike? Matthew Hancock, thinking, of course, of the current difficulties that brought London to a halt for the 48 hours.
Yes, well, many of us were delayed on the way down here, and you know, I support the trade union movement, and I work with the trade union movement, for instance, on expanding apprenticeships, and I think that they are badly served by their bosses, because there was not a majority of trade unionists who voted for this action. The majority of workers on the tube didn't vote for this action, and they were driven into it by their bosses. And I think that we do need to look at the way that those votes take place, and we also need to think about whether essential services can be brought to a standstill. For instance, the police can't strike because you wouldn't want a moment when all of the police in the country weren't at work.
So are you in favour of essential services being refused the right to strike?
Well, I think that
I mean, the New York subway, I believe they have no right to strike.
I do think that we need to consider it. But I don't think we should.
What's consider mean exactly?
Well, I think
have a look.
but I don't think that we should do it off the, in the midst of the of a strike which has been so destructive. Because
Isn't that the right moment to think about?
Because we need to balance, on the one hand, the right to withdraw your labour is an important right, but just as important, and I would say this week more important, is the ability to keep our country going and the ability for people to be able to get on with their lives. And the strike this week has shown that despite the fact that a majority didn't vote for it, they managed to have a big disruptive impact, which means that doctors haven't been able to get in to treat their patients, that teachers haven't been able to get into schools to teach. And I think that this strike was absolutely wrong, and we need to look at whether we need to change the rules about it.
Do you want the right to strike refused?
Personally, I think that members of the London Underground who decide to strike, I think that is an essential service. If you look at situations, horrific situations such as a terrorist attack or 7/7, you look at those supervisors, the number of people in those stations who helped evacuate people who were in those tunnels, who are in those moments, those crucial moments where they were then supported by the emergency services. You can see the focus and the importance of that service, and you can see the importance of it to London as a financial capital. If the real losers at the end of the day are going to be the millions of Londoners who haven't got to work, aren't able to get to work, where the economy then suffers when we've been growing. And to be honest, personally, I find the fact that the RMT officials haven't really met properly with Boris Johnson, or whatever there's a breakdown of communications, is frankly ridiculous.
OK. George Galloway.
Well, this is what happens when you elect a clown as the Mayor of London. And it's not very funny. And the suffering that has occurred over the last 48 hours is not funny for anybody. And it's not funny for the workers who had to lose 2 days' pay over it. By the way, the workers voted to strike. I wouldn't like anyone to be misled. You support trade unions like the rope supports the hanging man. The truth is that Boris Johnson provoked this strike by issuing a fiat to close every ticket office in London and make hundreds of people redundant without negotiating it with the people who are paid to represent the interests of the staff. You know, it's not rocket science. 5 years, Boris Johnson has not met with the leaders of the RMT. This is contempt, Tory contempt for working people and their organisations. And in the final analysis, working people only have their labour to withdraw. They don't have your money. They don't have the money that the people in the City of London have. They don't have any power except their own labour power and the right legally, democratically to decide to withdraw it for a day or two.
Only 30% of members of the RMT voted for this strike.
You're assuming the others were all against it.
Only 30% of people voted for Boris Johnson.
Well, no,
And the plan is perfectly reasonable, and not to close every ticket office. And in fact, covered.
Why are you saying that? It is to close every single ticket office on the London Underground. You don't even know what your own mayor's doing.
That's just not true. And also, it's well covered by voluntary. People applying for voluntary redundancy. It's a perfectly reasonable plan, and there's no good reasonable argument for bringing London to a halt.
All right, the woman up there.
Well, firstly, I think it's really unfair of you to suggest that people are just striking to prevent people from getting to work. They're striking because they're angry. Yeah. And if politicians are just going to say they're only going to consider helping them in the future, then it's no wonder that they want to strike to begin with.
OK. And you, sir, in the centre there. Yes.
I totally support the right of anyone to take strike action, but the London Underground is one of the most expensive underground systems in Europe.
Thanks to Boris.
Surely this is a way of improving efficiency on the underground system and hopefully reducing fares.
All right, let's come back to the issue of whether it's so important that there should be no right to strike in this and other essential services. David Starkey, what do you think?
I think generally the rule is that there should be no right to strike. Because what is happening in this strike, and indeed has happened in the London Underground over the last 15 or 20 years, is a process of pure extortion. Bill Crow is not an ineffective trade union leader. Bill Crow is a staggeringly... Bob, whatever he is. The large, fat, red man with the pina coladas is an incredibly effective trade union leader. They are paid £52,000
Heaven forbid. How much do you earn? A lot more than that. For a less onerous, less responsible job.
Come on. Their jobs could be replaced by a dummy. Most of the trains are designed to run automatically. Come on, these trains are designed and intended to run automatically, as every subway system in the world is increasingly doing. Now, what has happened with London Underground is that it has been mismanaged by both Livingston and by the current mayor. Livingston deliberately encouraged the trade unions. Boris is a hopeless administrator. Ken Livingston is a malign genius. And London TfL needs shaking up from top to bottom. The reason fares are so scandalously expensive is mismanagement on an unbelievable scale.
But is it a service so essential that the law that applies to the police and the military, that they're not allowed to strike?
If we were any other European country, it would be. Yeah. I was actually astonished to discover that we are the only country in Europe that does not have a coherent body of law defining essential services and defining what you have to do in the event of a strike. It's not about you're never allowed to strike, but it's that if you do go on strike, there is a basic minimum that you are obliged to maintain. And I was absolutely astonished. Every country in Europe except us has a very clear body of law relating to that, and yes, it includes public transport in large cities.
So what would the effect of that be in London?
It would have meant that you had to keep a service going on every single line at a certain level. It wouldn't have meant that you couldn't take any industrial action, but it would have meant that people who really had to get around could. And in terms of withdrawing your labour, I mean, you know, I have friends who have lost large amounts of money because their businesses effectively had no takings over the last 2 days.
Right. Well,
so, you know, this is why these are defined as essential. They're defined as essential because they are essential to allowing other people to carry out their normal life, essential to allowing people to get to doctor's appointments, get to school, get to work, get to businesses. That's what essential means.
Tessa Jowell, let's just define you a little bit here. You may be the person who challenges for the mayoralty of London.
Well, you may know more than I do.
No, I said you may be, and I know many people tip you to be mayor of London. Were you mayor of London? What will you do about this?
Well, first of all, I would not support withdrawing the right to strike from public sector workers. In response to Alison's point, you know, I got the tube, the bus yesterday. It was inconvenient, long delays and all the rest of it, but it was possible to get it. It met your standard of a basic service. But, you know, I think that withdrawing the right to strike assumes that public sector workers undertake industrial action in a kind of reckless, unthinking way, and they don't. And this was a strike. A second. Okay, David, stop it. This was a strike that was completely preventable. completely preventable had, first of all, Boris Johnson not broken the promise that he made when he was elected. He promised that no ticket stations, ticket offices would be closed. I actually think that there is a case for, getting people out of ticket offices and out on the platforms. All that could have been negotiated had we not had the farce of Boris Johnson and Bob Crow. The only way they could talk to each other was by phoning LBC and having their discussion mediated by Bob Crow. That is not the way to do it.
OK.
Well, Boris stood on a very clear platform of modernising the tube. And you know why we need to modernise the tube?
He promised to keep the ticket offices.
He stood on a platform of modernising the tube.
Can I read the quote out, just so we get round this point? 2010, the Mayor takes this promises to London extremely seriously. Every station that has a ticket office will continue to have one. Statement from City Hall.
The question is, how many people do you put in ticket offices, and are people better on the station platforms, this is the proposal, on the station platforms, helping people when
why did he say this?
Only 3% of the travelling public use the ticket offices.
So why did he go out on a limb only 3 years ago to say every station will have a ticket office?
Because, of course, there will still be places you can go in each station.
You're struggling here, man.
No, and then why not? No, because I'm very clear. You have people. There will be people available, right, for when people have
So this is called the student loans moment, isn't it? Yes.
But the crucial thing about improving the tube is that then we can keep the prices on it down. And you can't keep the travelling public moving and moving at a reasonable cost if you set everything in stone and say that when 97% of people who use the tube don't go through a ticket office, we need to have them and staffed up because Bob Crow says so.
All right, let's just take one more point from the person at the back there.
I completely agree with Tessa there. Everyone should have the right to strike. Why? It depends what their job is. Just because they're brave enough to do that job, it doesn't change their right to strike.
Including the police.
And the right...
What do you make of... Are you then saying the... Come on.
What about the firefighters?
Their right to strike should encourage
firefighters?
other politicians to sort out the situation.
I'm
and waiting
asking you a
24
little
hours so it's
question.
all over.
You've said everybody should have the right to strike. Are you saying the police should have the right to strike?
Well, yeah. And the threat of that...
Well, yeah. Is this how we conduct debate?
And the threat of that strike should make decisions.
I don't think it's wise to insult our audience, David.
On the contrary, the audience occasionally needs it. No. It is an honest debate and not somebody who's afraid.
I'll take one more point from the... No, I've had you and... you, sir, in spectacles there, yes. Yeah.
Sorry, I think the most important thing in this is actually being lost. The people involved in the underground who work for TfL are being completely forgotten. Unfortunately, you've got two egos completely dominating this argument. The media is spinning it to be a Bob Crow versus Boris Johnson. Now, the thing is, if you take away the people's right to strike, what else have they got? If the unions aren't working, what protection is there for the common man in a dispute that isn't striking?
OK.
Have you heard of employment law? Do you know the huge structure of employment protection that now exists? Strikes in the public sector are mere extortion against you and me. That's all they are, which is why they're paid $52,000 a year.
Well, some of them are. Can I just deal with this? Because it's not true. Some underground workers earn $52,000 a year.
The drivers, who do nothing.
52,000 is a bad month's bonus for a banker in the City of London. Give me a tube driver with hundreds of people at his back. That's a responsible and important job. If the bankers went on strike, we'd all be better off.
All right.